Welcome back to Newsmax Now. I'm John Bachman. The U.S. has officially announced $50 billion worth of tariffs on Chinese imports. The White House released a statement that read in part, the United States will pursue additional tariffs as China engages in retaliatory measures, such as imposing new tariffs on U.S. goods, services, or agricultural products. So are we in a trade war? And what would that mean for the average American? Joining me now to break it all down is University of Maryland economist Peter Morici. Peter, great to see you again.
Nice to be with you.
All right, here are some of the tariffs that have made it much more difficult for the U.S. companies to sell goods in China. Let's take a look at some of these. China adds 25% tariffs on cars from the U.S., where we only add 2.5% tariffs on cars that are imported into the United States. Volvo, Buick, and Cadillac all make cars in China and import them into the United States. Some people might be surprised to hear that. That means thousands more on average in prices for those cars, where China only gets hit with a couple hundred extra dollars on the cars made in the U.S. exported to China. China also adds 30% tariffs on motorcycles and 67% tariffs on wine. I think totally the trade imbalance is something like $325 billion a year. Peter, how can you explain, or can you explain for us, how these Chinese tariffs are hurting average Americans?
Well, the bottom line is we have this huge trade deficit with China. China exports to us 3.5 times as much as we export to them because of these barriers. For years, one of the most popular cars in China were Buicks. I can't explain why, but we couldn't make them in Detroit and send them over there. With a 25% tariff, it's wholly impractical. So we had to set up a Buick plant there. And then the Chinese government demands 51% ownership of the plant and requires General Motors to teach their engineers how to do it. We have been in a trade war for decades with China, and we've watched one weak-kneed president after another. We are not starting a trade war. We're just ending the Bush-Obama policy of appeasement. By the way, the debacle that is our trade deficit with China has been a joint venture of the Republican and Democratic parties. Both have bowed to Wall Street on this. Even now, as you and I speak, Secretary Mnuchin is crying, screaming, whining on his knees. Please don't do this. You know why? Wall Street doesn't give a damn who has the jobs. No matter which way the goods flow, it gets to provide the financing and make the deals and makes money.
Yeah, think of it like this, too. I mean, there are entire superstores like Walmart in this country that are filled with Chinese goods. There are no stores in China that are filled with American goods like they are Walmarts here in this country. Now, as you heard, of course, as you heard, the White House threatened more tariffs. I'm sorry, I didn't catch that, Peter. Go ahead.
You have a store full of goods when they won't let them in. No, this is an absurd situation. But I don't like Donald Trump's strategy, and I'll tell you why. He puts tariff on $50 million worth of Chinese goods. They put tariffs on $50 million worth of American goods. 3 rounds of that, and our exports are wiped out because we only send about $150 billion over there, and they send like $350 billion over here or $400 billion over here. We really ought to just whack them across the board. Frankly,
go into detail on that, because I was going to ask you, what would you suggest if you were advising President Trump on this? How would you handle it?
I would not have a tariff. What I would do is basically give out resaleable import quotas to exporters to China. Would you send $1 worth of goods to China? Here's a quota worth $1 to import the goods. Now, of course, exporters don't import, so they could sell it to someone else. That would require the trade to balance. Now, they could sell those so they would get around, and that way, the people who want the Chinese goods the most would, in turn, pay the most, for the quotas. But if China retaliated by cutting off our exports, then the amount of goods we would buy would be smaller. Now, I wouldn't make it dollar for dollar initially because there is a trade deficit that's 3.5 to 1. I might make it 3 to 1 to cut the deficit by $50 billion in the first 6 months. And then every 6 months, I would reduce those quotas. And if China retaliated, then they'd get to sell us less stuff. That's the first thing I would do. The second thing is I would mirror their tariffs. They want to have a 25% tariff on cars? Congratulations. We'll have a 25% tariff on Chinese auto parts. Now, Detroit will cry and scream, we need those auto parts. Well, guess what? Start making them in a Delco factory like you used to instead of profiting on the backs of American workers. The third thing I would do is There's lots of Chinese companies that are benefiting from subsidies from Chinese banks and from the Chinese government. I would sanction those companies just like we sanction, say, companies that participate in terrorism. And I'd sanction their banks so that they can't do business in our dollar clearing system. Let me tell you something. Mr. Z would not likely want to get out of bed in the morning if I was conducting this trade war. Now, would it hurt Americans? You bet it would. But we need to go through some pain to fix this mess.
That's the unfortunate thing. Politicians aren't willing to. They're worried about getting reelected if Americans feel pain. Now, here is former White House economic advisor Gary Cohn. He's warning that the trade disputes could wipe out the benefits of the GOP's tax reform plan. Do you think that's a possibility?
Oh, I think it really is, simply because of the way they're conducting this thing. We put on 50 billion, they put on 50 billion, we put on 100 billion, they put on 100 billion. Our exports are going to get wiped out this way long before their exports are going to get wiped out. But also, let's remember who Gary Cohn is. Gary Cohn is an aluminum siding salesman that managed to get a job on Wall Street. Basically, he became a trader. And he climbed the ladder by being a good bureaucrat. His knowledge of economics is about as, good as my knowledge of bond trading. This is the problem with people from Wall Street, is they understand a narrow market. They understand how to make money on, say, egg futures or oil futures or something like that. For example, Mr. Mnuchin's speciality is foreclosing on old ladies and using it with government-insured banks. He made his fortune, basically foreclosing on old ladies. That doesn't help you much in making trade policy. It just doesn't. Remember, they're the guys who gave Bill Clinton all that good advice that led to the global financial crisis, repealing Glass-Steagall and all that. Every bit of advice that you get at Treasury from Goldman Sachs, and that's where we get our Treasury secretaries, generally comes down to advice that helps Goldman Sachs make money.
Yeah, well, that might be the problem. Peter, great to get your insight on that. Coming up, we got to go. Good to see you. Coming up, the host of the most popular and most unusual overnight radio show in the country, George Norrie, will be with us. You won't want to miss this interview. Keep it right here on Newsmax now.